Modern psychology seems to us particularly concerned to prove that we perceive things through the medium of certain forms, borrowed from our own constitution. This tendency has become more and more marked since Kant. While the German philosopher drew a sharp line of separation between time and space, the extensive and the intensive, and, as we should say today, consciousness and external perception, the empirical school, carrying analysis still further, tries to reconstruct the extensive out of the intensive, space out of duration, and externality out of inner states. Physics, moreover, comes in to complete the work of psychology in this respect. It shows that if we wish to forecast phenomena, we must make a clean sweep of the impression which they produce on consciousness and treat sensations as signs of reality, not as reality itself. It seemed to us that there was good reason to set ourselves the opposite problem and to ask whether the most obvious states of the ego itself, which we believe that we grasp directly, are not mostly perceived through the medium of certain forms borrowed from the external world, which thus gives us back what we have lent it. A priori, it seems fairly probable that this is what happens. For, assuming that the forms alluded to, into which we fit matter, come entirely from the mind, it seems difficult to apply them constantly to objects without the latter soon leaving a mark on them. By then using these forms to gain a knowledge of our own person, we run the risk of mistaking for the colouring of the self the reflection of the frame in which we place it, that is, the external world. But one can go further still and assert that forms applicable to things cannot be entirely our own work, that they must result from a compromise between matter and mind, that if we give much to matter, we probably receive something from it, and that thus, when we try to grasp ourselves after an excursion into the external world, we no longer have our hands free. Now, just as, in order to ascertain the real relations of physical phenomena to one another, we abstract whatever obviously clashes with them in our way of perceiving and thinking, so, in order to view the self in its original purity, psychology ought to eliminate or correct certain forms which bear the obvious mark of the external world. What are these forms? When isolated from one another and regarded as so many distinct units, psychic states seem to be more or less intense. Next, looked at in their multiplicity, they unfold in time and constitute duration. Finally, in their relations to one another, and in so far as a certain unity is preserved throughout their multiplicity, they seem to determine one another. Intensity, duration, voluntary determination, these are the three ideas which had to be clarified by ridding them of all that they owe to the intrusion of the sensible world, and, in a word, to the obsession of the idea of space. Examining the first of these ideas, we found that psychic phenomena were in themselves pure quality, or qualitative multiplicity, and that, on the other hand, their cause situated in space was quantity. Insofar as this quality becomes the sign of the quantity, and we suspect the presence of the latter behind the former, we call it intensity. The intensity of a simple state, therefore, is not quantity, but its qualitative sign. You will find that it arises from a compromise between pure quality, which is the state of consciousness, and pure quantity, which is necessarily space. Now you give up this compromise without the least scruple when you study external things, since you then leave aside the forces themselves, assuming that they exist, and consider only their measurable and extended effects. Why then do you keep to this hybrid concept when you analyze in its turn the state of consciousness? If magnitude outside you is never intensive, intensity within you is never magnitude. It is through having overlooked this that philosophers have been compelled to distinguish two kinds of quantity, the one extensive, the other intensive, without ever succeeding in explaining what they had in common or how the same words increase and decrease could be used for things so unlike. In the same way, they are responsible for the exaggerations of psychophysics, for as soon as the power of increasing in magnitude is attributed to sensation in any other than a metaphorical sense, we are invited to find out by how much it increases. And although consciousness does not measure intensive quantity, it does not follow that science may not succeed indirectly in doing so if it be a magnitude. Hence, either a psychophysical formula is possible, or the intensity of a simple psychic state is pure quality. Turning then to the concept of multiplicity, we saw that to construct a number, we must first have the intuition of a homogeneous medium, in other words space, in which terms distinct from one another could be set out in line. And secondly, a process of permeation and organization by which these units are dynamically added together and form what we call a qualitative multiplicity. It is owing to this dynamic process that the units get added, but it is because of their presence in space that they remain distinct. Hence, number or discrete multiplicity also results from a compromise. Now, when we consider material objects in themselves, we give up this compromise, since we regard them as impenetrable and divisible, that is, endlessly distinct from one another. Therefore, we must give it up too when we study our own selves. It is through having failed to do so that associationism has made many mistakes, such as trying to reconstruct a psychic state by the addition of distinct states of consciousness, thus substituting the symbol of the ego for the ego itself.